Meet Dr. Benjamin Franklin, our most accomplished, most accessible, and most paradoxical founding father. He was the entire package: scientist, inventor, journalist, businessman, and statesman.
I became convinced that Benjamin Franklin was the great American genius.
His achievements were unparalleled. He was the driving force behind America's first public lending library, first non-religious college, and first national newspaper. As a diplomat, he helped make American independence a reality.
Next to George Washington, Benjamin Franklin is probably the most indispensable person when it comes to winning the revolution.
And in matters of science, he was nothing less than the greatest thinker of his time.
We can certainly compare Franklin's work with electricity with the Wright brothers' work with aviation.
Beyond his greatness, however, there was another side to Benjamin Franklin. And that side doesn't always show up in the history books.
Throughout his life, Franklin's governed by sexual passions, he says.
We're not talking about a guy who's some moral superstar here.
Franklin wasn't above engaging in dirty tricks against his opponents.
And if he could be said to have a great failing, I think it's probably in his family relations that it's most clear.
For more than 200 years, Ben Franklin has inspired and confounded us. He has been analyzed, criticized, and scrutinized by an army of biographers. Yet the essence of the man remains elusive. Ben Franklin, it turns out, is everything we think he is, and a lot more that we never imagined. For someone who has been a national icon for well over 200 years, Benjamin Franklin remains surprisingly enigmatic. His long public life and prolific writings present us with a maze of different personas. At times, Franklin is diplomatic, at others, skeptical. He can be flirtatious, wary, conciliatory, witty, or maddeningly patient. He is rarely stubborn, usually wise, often candid, and, whenever necessary, artfully evasive. The doorway into this hall of mirrors is Franklin's autobiography, which he began writing at the age of 65.
The autobiography tells us not who Franklin was, which is how many people have read it, but how Franklin saw himself, and more importantly, how he wished others to see him.
Franklin was all too familiar with his nature, both strengths and weaknesses. During those first years in Philadelphia, he had embarked on a quest for what he called moral perfection.
He compiles from his reading a list of what he accepts to be 12 common virtues: modesty, frugality, industry, moderation, temperance, chastity. And then he defines each of these terms and sets for himself the task of conquering each one in the course of a week.
In his autobiography, Ben admits with some bemusement that the project was probably doomed from the start. While my attention was taken up in guarding against one fault, I was often surprised by another. Habit took advantage of inattention. Inclination was sometimes too strong for reason. Franklin's imprint on the civic life of the country can be traced at least as far back as 1727, when he organized a small social club, the Junto. The 12-member group, which met every Friday evening in a local tavern, included a cobbler, a clerk, a cabinet maker, and several printers.
The Junto is a group of apprentices, journeymen, all of them clearly smart, ambitious, young kids on the make, looking to advance themselves in the Philadelphia economy.
You could call it a seminar of self-improvement. The people who were part of this seminar, part of this discussion club, were people who were in a similar situation as Franklin. And for the most part, they didn't have formal schooling, but they were very interested in educating themselves.
Franklin and the Junto hatched plans that would change the world. They helped establish Philadelphia's first volunteer fire department and the first non-religious college in America, the Philadelphia Academy. It survives today as the University of Pennsylvania. Among their greatest achievements was the creation of America's first public lending library, the Library Company of Philadelphia. Thanks to the Junto, books would no longer be the exclusive domain of the wealthy and well-connected.
They were simply trying to improve themselves. But in breaking down this fundamental barrier of class that had separated the uneducated from the educated, the wealthy from the people with lesser resources, they made it possible for people like Franklin, who should have had no business engaging in political discussions, philosophical discussions at a very high level, to do exactly that. And it's this class that's going to spearhead the American Revolution in the 1760s and 1770s.
Some of Ben's most calculated moves pertain to matters of religion. For starters, he had to learn to navigate between Philadelphia's various congregations.
You've got to understand what the Presbyterians like, you've got to understand what the Quakers like, though the Presbyterians and the Quakers hate each other. And if you're going to be the kind of a cultural broker that Franklin was, you can't be one or the other of those.
During his lifetime, Franklin donated to the building fund of each and every church built in Philadelphia. He's one of the largest individual contributors to the first synagogue built in Philadelphia.
He thought religions all did good, and he cared not a fig about their doctrinal differences, but he was perfectly willing to support civic institutions that ameliorated the life of his fellow citizens.
While being a friend to all of Philadelphia's religions, Ben also nurtured his own beliefs.
Franklin was very clear about religion. He feels that there is a God, and God has created the world and is to be worshipped, that the best way one can worship God is by doing good among men.
Franklin never went anywhere, never did anything without looking around and asking himself, what is going on? Why is this so?
Franklin's questions, and more importantly, his answers, fueled a lifetime of remarkable discoveries. During a transatlantic voyage, Ben becomes curious about anomalies in ocean temperatures and ends up charting what we now know as the Gulf Stream. After calculating the physics of heat radiation and convection currents, Ben designs the most efficient home heating device of the 18th century, the Franklin stove. When Ben becomes fed up changing between reading glasses and distance glasses, he mounts half of each lens in both sides of his frames. He calls the design double spectacles. Today, we call them bifocals. It was Franklin's work with electricity that would make him a legend for the ages.
Franklin came to electricity at a time when electricity was not quite a science. It was a curiosity. It was almost, well, often was, a vaudeville act.
After seeing one of these shows, Ben was hooked. He acquired this contraption, known as a Hauksbee generator. Its sole purpose was to create static electricity.
This Hauksbee generator is very similar to the kind of device Franklin used to generate electrical charges. This plastic drum will pick up electrical charges from this pad as I crank it. Those electrons will then be transferred through the brass fingers onto the collection cylinder and then out to the distribution point.
The charge can also be directed along a chain to a pair of metal dishes, where objects like styrofoam peanuts rise and fall in response to the invisible flow of electrons. Franklin performed a similar trick using a small spider made of fabric. Through simple experiments like these, Franklin develops his landmark theory of electricity. He begins with an entirely new terminology.
Battery, plus and minus, charge and discharge, things we normally use every day. Franklin was the first to use these words in relation to electricity.
Franklin's discovery of the single fluid theory of electricity, that electricity is a flow from positive to negative, is actually the most important discovery of that century. It compares to both Newton's theory of gravity in the century before and the theory of transistors and microchips in our own century, because it has very practical implications.
Franklin's most important contribution, however, and the one for which he is most known, was to demonstrate that lightning is, in fact, a form of electricity.
This flew directly in the face of the religious concepts at the time of thunderstorms. Lightning and thunder were definitely acts of God, even punishments of God.
Fires started by lightning could decimate entire towns. Single-handedly, Franklin would find a way to prevent these natural calamities.
Franklin devised a theory of electricity, how the particles in the atmosphere jostling around in a thunderstorm would create these charges, just like the ones in the laboratory. But most importantly, he devised a way to test it.
Franklin publishes his theories and a plan for testing them in 1751. In May of 1752, French scientists, following his instructions, are the first to prove conclusively that lightning is indeed nothing more than electricity. In June, before news arrives from France, Ben is ready to conduct his famous kite experiment. The concept seems simple today. A small wire on the kite will draw an electric charge from the clouds. The charge will then travel down a string to a key tied onto the line.
The small electric spark that he got from his kite through the key definitely showed him that lightning really was just the same static electricity he'd been experimenting with on a small scale, except this scale was absolutely enormous.
Within weeks, Franklin unveils his lightning rod, which remains the reliable way to channel a lightning bolt harmlessly into the ground. At the age of 46, Ben had secured his place in history.
There are a number of legacies left over by the Founding Fathers, but one of the most practical ones is the lightning rod created by Benjamin Franklin. Every building, every edifice in the world that stands at some height has one. And one might argue that without the lightning rod, tall buildings might not have come into existence.
Franklin was the one who, well, as people saw or put it, tamed the lightning. He stole the lightning from the heavens. After Franklin's researches in electricity became known, he was one of the most famous people in the Western world.
He gets honorary degrees in Edinburgh and then at Oxford and Cambridge and eventually Yale and Harvard in the United States. And thereafter, he kind of allowed himself to be referred to as Dr. Franklin.
Though Ben enjoyed the worldwide acclaim, he refused to patent any of his inventions. He didn't earn a dime from the lightning rod or the stove, and that was just the way he wanted it.
He felt that he didn't need any more money, and it was far more important that he could simply contribute to the well-being of society. The lightning rod in particular, he felt was going to save lots of lives, save lots of homes and buildings from destruction. It was far more important to him that this invention be disseminated broadly than that he, Franklin, should turn a profit from it.
Ben's discoveries and inventions alone would probably have been enough to guarantee his lasting fame. But Ben Franklin's greatest achievement was still on the horizon. Challenging the political order and establishing American independence would become Franklin's most enduring legacy. Before he could raise the flag of rebellion, however, Benjamin Franklin would have to question his loyalty to the Crown of England. In short, he would have to question himself.